Let's go ahead and do the meeting beginning ritual, everyone. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位点传师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
Thank you, sir, and good morning, everybody. It's a cloudy, overcast, and really kind of rainy day in scenic Indianapolis. But, like I say pretty much every Sunday, it's a wonderful day to be able to get together and share in this process of hopefully discovering and learning about the Tao teachings. I realized that I had said previously I was going to be talking about the rituals today. I'm actually going to push that discussion off for a week or so, primarily because a much more pressing, a much more immediate topic came to mind last week that I think bears some discussing. As you all know, I get not a small number of emails that have to do with topics that we discuss here, and you know, various and sundry other things from folks in the study group. And this topic here is the result of one of those emails. And the reason that it's called Finding the Path is because in reality, I think, particularly here in the West, that's kind of the uniting thread that runs through a lot of these emails. Questions that range everywhere from, you know, how do we know we're not being led down the rosy path? How do we know that what we hear is authentic, that it's what Lao Tzu said, or that it was what the teachings intended? Or, you know, I'm listening to this person or that person, and here's what they say. Does that ring true? Is that something I should follow? Okay, those are wonderful questions. And one such question kind of came up last week about a particular set of practices involving a shrine from a different tradition. And so I did the best that I could to answer that question in email, and I think I did a fairly adequate job of that. But there were so many other things left unsaid and untouched because of the medium. You know, it's important, I think, not to try to write a copy of War and Peace in an email. And so, you know, I try to keep things relatively brief and to the point. So how do we know? Well, the question I received is centered around a holistic approach to the practice of Qigong within the sacred space. And that particular question was one that was specific to a particular tradition. My apologies, the dryer's going off. But what I tried to say in my reply was that there are many, many paths that lead people to the discovery of the Tao teachings, and many traditions that one can choose to follow in one's discovery of both their own Buddha nature and of the Tao teachings. It may have seemed in my written response that I was being somewhat exclusive because I asked about the particular tradition and origin of the shrine, and pointed out that in all likelihood this was not an Iguandao house shrine of Bunting, as we talk here about. But the truth of the matter is, even though I wanted to understand the source of the tradition and the shrine, we don't exclude any uplifting philosophy or belief system here. For me, that was merely a desire to understand where the question came from, because my answer to that question was couched in the Iguandao tradition and in our path. In the West, it seems that very many people come to the Tao teachings originally by becoming involved in one of the Asian martial sciences practices. That seems to be a very popular and very available way for people to begin to explore that avenue of spirituality. And in fact, for many people here in the U.S., that may be the only availability to that type of spirituality, unless one lives in a city with a large Asian population like Los Angeles or New York. Here in the Midwest, in Indianapolis, for instance, the ability and availability of real masters of the Tao teachings is extremely limited. And in fact, it's virtually non-existent. A lot of that has to do with the path of immigration, which tends to favor the large coastal cities and what have you. And by extension, the geography that brings one to the American Midwest. You know, they're just, with the exception of Chicago, where there's a pretty substantial Asian population, the Midwest is largely kind of a devoid of those influences. And so that path of martial instruction, whether it's authentic or not, whether it's from our tradition or not, still becomes the entry point very often for a lot of Westerners. But particularly here, and I can speak with a pretty high degree of authority and knowledge about the Indianapolis area anyway, most of the martial schools here have long since abandoned the spiritual roots of their traditions in favor of profit, plain and simply. It is difficult and sometimes repellent to American Midwesterners to have someone suggest that their Judeo-Christian tradition may not be the only set of answers available. And many parents here do not want their children exposed to philosophies or spirituality that they themselves did not introduce their children to. And so what I've seen over time is that once deeply spiritual and rigorous practices in the martial sciences have been cleansed, if you will, of their spiritual roots and teachings, and left only to teach the fighting arts, the defensive arts, that to me is an aberration. Those sorts of schools only impart a small fraction of the genuine training to their students, and although they may become very proficient fighters, they don't learn the much deeper understanding of what it means not to fight. And yet, for some students in those schools, such as myself, the beginning of that training is also the beginning of the questions that lead one to the discovery, perhaps, of our temple in LA or some other organization here in the U.S. of a similar path and set of traditions. I can't speak to those other paths and other traditions. I can only speak authoritatively and only marginally so there of our own. But I'm much more comfortable with that than some others. And so when we talk about the establishment of an Iguandao shrine, first of all, that shrine does not originate from a martial path. While it is true that we may, in large part, be introduced to Asian philosophy through a martial path, the Iguandao is not, in and of itself, involved in a martial discipline. And so the shrines are not based in any kind of a martial approach. And in point of fact, even the practices of the Shaolin and Wudang Mountain, perhaps the two most well-known temples in the West that encourage and foster and further the martial traditions, teach that fighting is not, the way to get through life. But here in the West, we don't really have access to the establishment of a Wudang extension shrine here somewhere, at least not that I know of. And our tradition is not based in a martial tradition. Our temples spring from Taiwan. Now, the really nifty thing about that, and I'm historically a bit thin, but I know enough that I know this is true. The folks who emigrated from China to Taiwan before the communists took over took with them a culture and a set of traditions that were as ancient as the Tao teachings themselves. The language spoken in Taiwan is much closer to the ancient Chinese that was spoken around the time of Lao Tzu than the Chinese that's currently spoken in mainland China, for instance. They took with them the knowledge of the authentic Tao teachings. They took with them the oral traditions of the ancient Tao teachings. They took with them a number of sages and masters in the Tao traditions who were truly evolved in their path and truly expert in their teaching. And it is from that rich set of traditions that the Iguandao sprung. Okay. Within the Iguandao, you'll hear very frequently of what is called the golden thread. It is the golden thread that binds a lineage of temples and shrines together in the Iguandao tradition and forms sort of the chain of authority, if you will, from the mother temple in Taiwan all the way down to the house shrines that exist here in Indianapolis and in Michigan. That golden thread flows through all of us, from the Grand Masters and Senior Masters all the way down to the laity and those of us who are attempting, hopefully one day, to master the Tao teachings. The teachings that come through that lineage, that golden thread, form the basis of our doctrine, the basis of what we practice and what we do. They form the bridge between the cultures, the interpretation of the language, and the understanding of Tao cultivation. Our intent as an organization is to bring the authentic philosophy of the Tao, the real teachings to as many people as have the karmic affinity to benefit from them. And since I myself can't tell who does and who doesn't just by looking at them, I'll share what I believe and what I know with anyone who asks. I typically don't go running up behind people downtown screaming repent. I find that causes an awful lot of trauma and ill will, although it would be funny. But the intent is to bring these life-altering and transforming teachings to all who see value in them, no matter where they are, no matter who they are. Okay? The way that we do that is not by overt proselytizing and evangelizing. The way we do that is by our example, not just by what we say, but by what we do and how we live. And part of that, in my case, also involves a martial tradition. For many years, since I was 13 years old, I've been involved in some form of martial training or another. I'm 57 now. That's a long time. But not everyone is involved in that tradition, and that's okay. Okay, we happily accept folks who have never set foot in a dojo or in a martial temple. That's just fine. And I run a Tai Chi school for as many people there who want to learn both the philosophy of the Tao and the implementation of the Tao teachings through the practice of Tai Chi training Qigong. I'm more than happy to share with them. But the real method is simply by setting an example that other people can look up to and think, gee, maybe I'd like to be kind of like that person. I can only hope that the example that I set for others is worthy of that kind of emulation. I wouldn't dare to presume or assume anything else. Our philosophy is one of inclusion. In the early history of the organization, we spoke of the 5 great religions, which was kind of a numerically significant way of recognizing the great faiths of the world. There were a few notable omissions, but at the time these teachings were written, that wasn't well known. The cultural gap, the language gap, and the geography gap go both ways. Just as very many people in the West have really pitifully little idea about what Chinese culture is like, what the language is like, what the philosophies and religions are like, among other things. Those folks who live in China and Taiwan and have never seen the United States only know the United States from what they've seen on TV or heard from other people who visited here. And that forms a remarkably incomplete picture of a society or a culture. It's one of the reasons why I admonish everybody who can hear me fairly regularly to be careful about what you accept and what you believe and what faith you take away from people who are telling you that they're masters of this teaching or that teaching or some other teaching, because the opportunity exists due to the lack of genuine understanding for folks to do an awful lot of damage, even if their intentions are pure. And so what we have is a thought process that kind of drives the Western mentality to investigate these teachings, but from a purely Western point of view. For instance, When I talk to people about the practice of Tai Chi being a lifelong discipline, something that's beneficial to someone for their entire life, they look at me like I'm crazy, because I'm talking about something that they may do for decades, 30, 40, 50 years. And what they want to hear very often is that inside of 6 months I can turn them into Bruce Lee. Well, I couldn't do that even if I wanted to, and even if I could, I wouldn't. But our society is a society of instant gratification, the treatment of symptoms. It's all about now and all about me. And that's a set of thought processes that's difficult to change. It's hard to get people to accept that there are other teachings, philosophies, and methods of living that are more beneficial, perhaps, to us than what we've done all of our lives. And that makes the bringing of the message of these teachings to the West a huge task. It's a monumental task. Derek faces that task every single Sunday as he attempts not only to translate the Tao Te Ching accurately, but then to interpret the translation in such a way that its meaning becomes clear to those of us who do not natively speak Chinese. That's a huge job. It's an incredibly arduous task that Derek actually shoulders really well. It means that within our organization, that there is a degree of fidelity that not every organization out there ascribes to. And that's not a judgment or condemnation of somebody else's practices. It simply is a statement of fact. If you want to find out whether or not somebody else really knows what they're talking about, take a copy of the Tao Te Ching annotated and explained, and then ask somebody to translate or interpret their version of the Tao Te Ching teachings for you. Very frequently, those interpretations are seriously lacking in substance and understanding. Okay. There's also an element of integrity involved in this process, because with the absence of good information comes the possibility for manipulating other people because of their ignorance. It's possible, and it happens, that people take advantage of other people by leading them to believe they have knowledge they do not have, of teachings they do not know, to use fear and manipulation to get money or other things out of other people who don't know the difference. If you Google the Hu Hua Ching on the internet, you will find everything from the proper explanation, which is that document is essentially a really bad kind of forgery of the Tao Te Ching, all the way to people extolling its virtues and attributing its authorship to Lao Tzu as an addendum, a sequel to the original teachings. And anyone can choose to believe anything based on what they see on the internet. Well, okay, we know that happens. And so from that perspective, Derek and I are both very, very careful and pretty vociferous about making sure that those folks who listen to this study group understand what the truth really is. That the meaning of the teachings is not obfuscated in some ambiguous, shadowy mystery and some kind of English mumbo jumbo that doesn't really add up to anything that anybody ever wrote. Okay? Because that stuff does happen. And so when I say that the Yiguandao as an organization holds itself to the highest standards of fidelity and integrity. When it comes to preserving the authentic Taoist teachings and interpreting them in such a way as to make them clear and meaningful without the agenda of manipulation, contrivance, and coercion, okay, that is what I speak of. It's an obligation that we take really seriously, and some folks don't quite take as seriously. I spoke a couple minutes ago about karmic affinity. Karmic affinity is that small, still voice in the back of your mind and your heart that says, when you encounter this organization and these teachings, that this is the place to be. There are, for sure, other paths and avenues to get to this same place. And not everyone has to follow Derek's path, my path, or somebody else's path. We only try to shine a light on the path that we've come to know as being true and beneficial for us. Everybody else kind of has to make their own choice. But that affinity is knowing and feeling when you hear the real teachings, when you encounter the authentic truth of the Tao Te Ching, that you found that genuine place to be. That affinity, if we listen to it, brings us to the place where we can expand the scope of our philosophical knowledge, where it can broaden our horizons with the genuine, real, honest to goodness, meaningful teachings, as opposed to what somebody thinks Lao Tzu said. It gives us a much bigger picture of the philosophy and its effects on people and on societies. We finally get to kind of draw the same picture in our minds that perhaps Lao Tzu saw when he penned the words. And I realize Lao Tzu is not his name, but still, it's a fitting title. And for folks like me, when we finally encounter the real honest to goodness Tao teachings, then the relationship, at least in my case, between my secular life, my spiritual life, and my martial life finally are united and illuminated. I spent a third of my life anyway looking for the spiritual teachings that went with the martial sciences practices I was engaged in. But because I lived in Indianapolis, finding that set of teachings, finding those answers was difficult and tedious. It wasn't until Derek and I first met on the MSN forums some years ago that I actually began to feel like I'd found somebody who knew what they were talking about. And that conversation and many others kind of led to this. It's that karmic affinity thing. There is a teaching in the original etiquette and disciplines of Yiguandao that I really like because it succinctly states the relationship between what we do in our secular and spiritual lives. It says that although our spiritual duties require much less of our time than our secular duties, that they are no less important. And that's a strong point to remember. If we only take care of our secular lives, if we never pursue the spiritual questions, if we don't look for the answers, then we've been remiss in the care and feeding of our spiritual duties. And we find one day that we're spiritually starving to death. The fact that here in the Midwest one has to work at it a bit to find the teachings only makes finding them the much more pleasant and beneficial and more satisfying, because one can persevere through all of the less than authentic teachings, we'll just put it that way, to find the truth. And the truth liberates us. It frees the mind and the heart and the spirit. I say this from time to time, and I'm going to say it again today. We have to be careful about what we believe when we're on the internet or just out wandering around, because there are so many choices, so many supposed masters, so many teachers and spiritual guides out there, and everybody's got an answer. Everybody's got an angle. An awful lot of those people are only there to separate you from your money, or to engage in a process of self-aggrandizement and self-glorification at the expense of those they supposedly are trying to teach, or at the worst, trying to appear as though they've achieved mastery of the teachings, when in fact their teaching is based on incomplete and erroneous translations of the teachings that won't lead anyone to an enlightenment. There are a plethora of temples and shrines and traditions and teachings out there in the U.S. And so it bears paying attention to that small, still voice in the back of your mind and in your heart that tells you when you found the truth. I speak a lot about my affinity for the Guandal. I will be here in this same spot doing this same thing until I drop dead, and I'm very happy with that choice. But the ultimate choice belongs to each and every one of you guys, all of you who can hear my voice or who might hear it at some other time. You guys have to choose, and your choices will determine whether or not you're transformed by your choice and how you're transformed by your choice. To not make any choice is still to choose. And so if you found a tradition such as this one that makes sense for you, that's clear, that's meaningful, uplifting, that you can believe and that makes sense, that's a wonderful thing. If not, I'd encourage you to keep looking until you do. And even if you find a choice that's founded in a tradition that is not necessarily that of the Guandao, you'll still be accepted here. We don't exclude anyone from an uplifting and reasonably beneficial tradition or path. Well, thank you all for letting me talk about this topic again. I think from time to time it's important to do that. And then to wrap it up, you guys know each person chooses their own path. It's the most intimate choice you ever get to make. I can't tell you what to choose or how to choose. I can only tell you what works for me. But hopefully in my telling you what works for me, you find a glimmer of some truth that might help you follow that path as well. You've got a right and a responsibility, not just to choose a path, but to change the path when that becomes the right thing to do. You don't have to stay on a particular course just because somebody says you ought to. Making time for our spiritual duties, that's one of the most important things we have to do. It is as important as taking care of our secular responsibilities, but our spiritual duties have a much bigger payoff in that they transform us inside and out. And so I want to encourage all of you to go down that path of self-discovery, that journey of enlightenment with us. And I truly hope that whatever it is you choose, however it is you choose to go, that works out to your benefit. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bill. I have so many comments to what you have just said. I want to share something with you. When you responded to the question about considerations of where in your house to place your shrine, the response that you delivered, what I said to you was that, well, that's exactly how Senior Master Yang would have responded to that question. So you're onto something there. And what I wanted to share with you is that I then passed on your response to Janice. I suggested that she take a look at it. So Janice was born into a Dao cultivating family. Her dad, my father-in-law, is actually one of the most respected masters of Guan Dao, who also happens to be an actual sage in real life, and those are in very short supply, as you know. Most of the ordained masters in the Guan Dao are not at that level. They're more closer to our own levels. So she looked at what you wrote, and her immediate reaction was that what she said, 很有到位. 4 characters, 很有到位. 很 means very, 有 means to have, or that there is. Dao, that's just, the Dao that we've been talking about all this time. Wei means flavor. What she meant is that your response has the authentic flavors of the Dao. So, Bill, that's actually a very nice little compliment there. So I wanted to share with you. That's the reason why I say that I think you're on the right path, and you have to, whatever it is that you're doing, you have to keep on doing it. If you're eating spinach every day, continue to do that. Eat your cereal in the morning, etc.
Thank you very much. That really very kind of you guys. Thank you.
And as far as the concept of the right path, the proper path versus an exclusive path, yes, indeed, we all hear from every direction people claiming that, well, our path is the only right path, everybody else is wrong. To a cultivator of the Tao, this claim, it seems so unlikely to be true. The reason is because we see every day in real life examples how no matter where it is that you're trying to get to, no matter what your destination happens to be, there's always more than one way to get there. If we compare spiritual cultivation to climbing a mountain, we're all trying to reach the peak of divinity, then we already know there's multiple ways of getting to the top of the mountain. For every single mountain on the face of this planet, that's true. And when we finally, so I would say that it doesn't matter what path you take. Some paths may be more scenic but take longer. Other paths may be more dangerous, more of a challenge. So what each person picks and chooses for himself or herself is really dependent on personal preference and personal need. It's, is there a right path for you? Yes, probably there is. Is it automatically the right path for everybody else? Well, probably not. So when we do all get to the top of the mountain, I would suggest that we would all be too happy by that particular attainment, too happy to argue about, hey, what path did you take to get here? Wait a minute, you took the wrong path. I don't think we will be talking about that at all. I think we'll be too busy celebrating and enjoying the view, the magnificent view from the top of the mountain. So that's my comment there. Let me also say on the subject of authenticity, I want people to know that just because you live in the Western world, you're living within Western culture, it actually doesn't mean that you are always at a disadvantage. Surprisingly, sometimes you are actually at an advantage. So let me give you one example. Everyone who's been listening to these talks, you pretty much know the correct way to say the word TAO is Tao with a D sound. We talk about that quite a bit. So I noticed that everyone is saying it correctly. Here at the temple, we have quite a few people who have their own kids. Some of these kids are teenagers. And occasionally, these kids get pressured by the parents to come into the temple. They usually don't. And this is the reality of the situation, guys. A lot of these are immigrant families, and as is true with many immigrants from all different parts of the world, it is usually a fact of life that the younger generation has a certain level of rejection of the tradition from which they come. You probably have seen that. So these kids aren't that crazy to come to the temple. Occasionally, they get pressured by the parents to come in. And why? Usually, the parents will say, well, I'm going to do a talk in Chinese. You have to translate me into English. Okay? So they end up with that duty. When they do, they always say, oh, we cultivate the Tao, Taoism, Taoist, They always say with a T sound. It doesn't matter how many times I tell them that that's wrong. Okay? And what do you suppose that is? It is because they are not aware of it, but they come from a culture that is much more of a group think than individualism. Okay? Western mindset is characterized by more of an individualistic outlook. The Eastern mindset is characterized by more of a group think or bowing to authority. So when these kids hear everybody else, non-Chinese say Tao, they automatically will assume that must be the right way. Okay? They will even to the extent that they will even say that, well, even though I speak Chinese, and when I speak Chinese, I say Tao, but since everybody says Tao, they must be right. Okay? And many of the Chinese parents themselves fall into the same trap because they don't really think for themselves, follow what other people do. So that is where your advantage is cultivating in the West, is that you get to listen to different sides of an argument. You get to make up your mind on what is suitable for yourself. You get to exercise your individualistic discernment, your own critical faculties. Let's go ahead and do the meeting closing ritual. 起立，面向佛堂，持架深鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架各位点传是一鞠躬，结班一鞠躬。Okay, guys, we are done.